Thank you, Steve, and thank you, Long. And greetings to everybody wherever you are. I got lucky this time. It's actually daytime. This is an amazing gathering of scholarly talent and practical experience, and it's a real privilege for me to be part of it. And I want to take a minute and congratulate Chen Long and his colleagues for building a really important research institution in a startlingly small number of years. It's really an impressive achievement. There's prolific output, much of it available on the Luohan Academy website. And it includes two really major complementary reports. The first one was digital technology and inclusive growth. And then we have the one that's being released today that Steve mentioned, understanding big data, the data calculus in the digital era. The first report on inclusive growth documents for Chinese e-commerce and fintech very striking inclusive features of the growth patterns that are enabled by these digital technologies, and specifically enabled not just by digital technologies in general, but by open platform-centered and architected digital and data-driven ecosystems that have built up around some of the e-commerce and fintech platforms in China. This first report I also want to mention suggests, I think persuasively, that data-driven ecosystems may efficiently solve at least some coordination problems via market structures with the connections via connected market structures, with the connections being an intelligent data and information layer sort of sitting over them. And they do this without requiring internalization within the firm. So I think that the Coase theorem, which tells us how to calculate where the boundaries of firms and markets occur, is probably still valid, but I think the boundaries themselves may be shifting in favor of markets in some environments. And that has all kinds of implications for innovation and entrepreneurial activity and so on. So it's a kind of open door for very interesting research. The second report picks up the analysis as I read it, in two really important ways. The first one asks a centrally important question, which is, where exactly does the value creation enabled by digital data come from? It's certainly not in standalone silos of data. Chen Long will say much more about this in his tour of the report, I'm sure. But for me, the short answer is the value comes from flows and sharing, and from pooling in certain use cases. And the value is realized from processing data to yield valuable and actionable insights and predictions. And it does this in a stunningly wide range of applications or use cases, from science to health to education to e-commerce to finance. And I'm sure there will be many more as we go along this journey. But precisely the value creating flows and sharing that goes along with big data, it also creates vulnerabilities and risks, and the potential for misuse, as I might add, as judged by the prevailing social values and norms, which may differ across cultures. And so the second, part of this report, and it's not necessarily sequential, asks the other really important question, which is what in some detail are the potential misuses of big data, and how via a whole variety of mechanisms, including defensive individual behavior and learning, regulation, legal, technological solutions, and institutional trust building mechanisms, can these vulnerabilities, risks, and so on be mitigated in ways that, to the extent possible, minimally impair the enormous economic and social value potential of the digital technologies, and specifically big data. In the world and in research, this is a work in process. And as I see it, it'll be a long time, if ever, before we think we're sort of at the end, in part because the digital underpinnings of the economy that we're all going through are changing so quickly. It's the quintessential moving target. And so these two reports, with a balanced assessment of the benefits, costs, and risks, to quote a well-known former central banker, as well as the discussion today and a wide range of research that's cited in this paper, I think will really advance progress in this area. There's no question we have a trust problem. I mean, we've all seen surveys. The last one I saw came from McKinsey. They surveyed 1,000 North American individuals or households and ask them about, which areas of the economy that use and require personal data did they trust. The highest ones, and they weren't very high, were healthcare and finance, and then it fell off dramatically across a whole range of sectors. So I think, we're not dealing with something that's unimportant. This going the wrong way. The trust deficits, if they were to expand, would significantly impair the benefits that we talked about before. I'm going to use the rest of my time to talk about what intrigues me, but let me just mention one thing that I find ironic. For the older members of this crowd, you will remember that in the early days of the internet, there was an enormous amount of enthusiastic discussion focused on empowering the consumer via the accessibility of vast troves of previously inaccessible data and information. And the view was that had the potential to reduce the informational asymmetries between consumers and suppliers of goods and services, with the deficit being on the consumer side. And in fact, that wasn't wrong. But it was an incomplete view. And the irony I find is that we now find ourselves in extensive discussions about protecting consumers, meaning the buyers, and users from potential abuses by suppliers of services who hold vast troves of personal data, or abuses by third parties that find a way to gain access to that data. And so that's kind of where we are. I think they're both legitimate points of view. We know there are broad benefits from big data. We've democratized access to information at negligible incremental cost globally. And that's just enormously important. We've reduced costs of remoteness in terms of access to information and markets. These technologies have provided a host of new services that have startlingly high values, based on the important research that Eric Brynjolfsson and his colleagues have done. We have new markets based on very low transaction costs associated with creating them. One thing we don't talk about as much, but I think we have an explosion of entrepreneurial activity globally, in part because of very low entry barriers in the digital systems. And we have increases in efficiency and quality of the matching function. An example in the report is the recommendation engines, as I'll touch on in a minute, but I'm sure Al Roth and others may want to talk about that. But what intrigues me and gets my attention is the impact of big data on the informational structure of markets, something I spent some time during my checkered career on. And so I think all of you on the call know what a pooling equilibrium is. It occurs in a range of markets where information is asymmetrically incomplete. And it occurs when there is real product differentiation on the selling side that is undetectable on the buying side of the market. And we know this impairs market performance. An example of it is adverse selection, a phenomenon you're all familiar with. Think lemons. And undetectable in this context means roughly that signaling and screening mechanisms that might close these informational gaps to some extent are either unavailable, or they have costs that are too large relative to the individual benefits of using them, so that they don't get used and you have pooling equilibrium. And pooling equilibria include cases where no transactions occur, as in the complete collapse of the market in the adverse selection case. And you can also, and I mentioned this without being able to go into it in detail, in markets you can have mixed pooling and separating equilibria, a mixture of the two. And the pooling tends to occur at the kind of low end of the market, which has adverse distributional effects. So if you stand back from this, or at least when I stand back from this and look at some of the use cases involving big data and deep learning algorithms, meaning algorithms that detect patterns in data that are otherwise basically invisible to us mortals, what you see is a partial undoing of pooling equilibria by reintroducing statistically or probabilistically product differentiation. In other words, big data, one of the powerful effects of big data is breaking pooling equilibrium. Another way to describe it, but it's not different in concept, is it's a kind of reverse adverse selection phenomenon.
Mike, I'm giving you a 2-minute warning here.
Okay, I'll just stop. Thanks, Steve.
Okay.
Big data in combination with artificial, sorry, in combination with artificial intelligence algorithms are new and relatively low-cost signaling or screening options is the way I think about it. And I think looking at it this way and thinking about it that way deserves some further attention and even some research. As in traditional signaling and screening mechanisms, in some cases, there'll be incentive effects that feed back on behavior, and that raises questions about the transparency of the algorithm and questions having to do with whether or not people know what to respond to. You can see this, by the way, since what I've said is fairly abstract, you can see this clearly in the first report, in the expansion of credit markets using big data and AI, observing people who are essentially out of the market. And I think Bengt Holmstrom may want to talk further about that. I expect to see a similar evolution that we've seen in credit markets occur in labor markets, where you have very detailed specific skills and experience that you might be able to detect with enough data on people's history, work history, and so on. Or you might be able to detect characteristics of individuals that signal that they can acquire these skills quickly. So I think labor markets are another area where we might see this. And I don't think it's unreasonable to speculate that an expansion of credible product differentiation will occur in a wide range of markets. Since I'm nearing the end of my time, let me just say, because to me, this is sort of an open-ended set of researchable subjects, and we have some foundation in it. But this is two-sided. We normally think of the information deficit as being on the buying side of the market. For insurance, we have to kind of flip it over and think of insurance as being a buyer of risk rather than a seller of insurance policies. But you can see from the report the very interesting discussion of recommendation engines and the impacts of withdrawing them in controlled experiments, that informational gaps and differentiation go both ways. In this case, sellers may not, in fact, they do not know the preferences of buyers. And the recommendation engines using the big data and use cases like it deliver on a business sort of mantra, which is know your customer. In other words, they help them target. And if you take the targeting away, you basically get something marketing and advertising and product recommendations that are somewhere between, they're pretty close to useless. So anyway, I just thought I'd introduce the discussion by saying I think there's a tremendous set of opportunities here to deepen our understanding, and I do think the evolution of the informational structure of markets is set for major changes. It's not true that separating equilibria are always better. They have distributional consequences that most of us haven't explored very thoroughly. Except when we include people from the bottom up. But so I'll just close with this. It's not clear in the case of health insurance, for example, that you want to dismantle the pooling equilibrium. Markets armed with these very powerful new tools operating on genetic and behavioral and relative data about your relatives, they will dismantle these pooling equilibria. And that's not necessarily where we want to end up. In the brave new world of biomedical science, we're all going to have pre-existing conditions, and it's not difficult to imagine a world in which we end up being able to insure ourselves against everything except the risks that are particularly pertinent to each of us individually. With that, I think that's enough
cautionary note. Yes, I think we'll wrap it up here. Mike,
we'll
thank
move
you
on
so much.
So,
and thank you
thanks.
again for